A November morning at the Riverside County Highway Patrol began as usual, with the smell of strong coffee and the hum of voices in a crowded briefing room. Sergeant James Baker sat in the front row, as he had done for the past 15 years of service. His dark blue uniform was impeccably ironed, his badge polished to a shine, and his short graying hair neatly cut the epitome of professionalism. Nicole Summers was 5 minutes late. She slipped into the room, trying to be inconspicuous, but Lieutenant Veronica Taylor instantly looked up from her papers. "Officer Summers," Taylor said in her characteristic tone that left no room for objection, "I'm glad you've decided to join us." "I'm sorry, Lieutenant. Accident on Highway 7, Nicole replied, taking an empty seat in the back row. Baker didn't turn around, but his shoulders visibly tensed. The colleague sitting next to him noticed the reaction and hummed quietly. Lieutenant Taylor began the briefing, reporting on the night's incident reports and hotspots that needed special attention. Her short gray hair and sharp eyes gave her the look of a stern teacher, ready to point out a mistake at a moment's notice. "In the last 2 weeks, we've had 4 serious accidents on the northbound stretch of the 95 freeway. 2 fatalities. We need to step up patrols. Sergeant Baker, are you on the day shift today?" "That's right, Lieutenant. 1800. "All right then. Take the area from mile 78 to mile 85. Officer Rodriguez will be with you." After the briefing, everyone went to their cars. Baker was leisurely checking his equipment and radio when he noticed Nicole walking across the parking lot. Their gazes met for a moment, and he quickly turned away, pretending to be completely absorbed in his duties. The day stretched on slowly. Baker and Rodriguez stopped a few speeders, wrote a dozen tickets, and helped change a tire for an elderly couple from Arizona. The usual work of the highway patrol, routine but unpredictable. At 16 hours and 30 minutes, they returned to the station to turn in their reports. In the hallway, Baker ran into Nicole, who was coming out of the women's locker room, already in uniform and ready for the night shift. "Sergeant," she nodded, trying to get around him. "Summers," he answered dryly, but suddenly added, "I hear you're assigned to 93 today?" "Yeah, North Precinct. It's quiet there now. Be careful. Street racers gather there after 10 o'clock at night." There was a genuine concern in his voice that seemed to surprise them both. Nicole hesitated a moment, looking at him with mild bewilderment. "Thank you for the warning," she finally replied, and quickly walked further down the hallway. Officer Martinez, standing at the water cooler, watched the scene with undisguised interest. "What, Baker, have you decided to take the younger generation under your wing?" He grinned as Nicole rounded the corner. "Just a professional courtesy." Baker cut him off and headed for his desk. At his desk, he opened a folder with reports, but his thoughts were far away. His gaze involuntarily fell on a framed photograph of him with his wife and 2 teenage daughters against the backdrop of the Grand Canyon. Typical happy family. That evening, as Baker was getting ready to go home, Lieutenant Taylor walked into the office with a concerned look on her face. "James, I have a problem. Jenkins is sick and we're short-staffed for the night shift. Can you stay?" Baker froze, clutching his car keys in his hand. "I have family plans, Veronica. I promised my daughters. I understand, but there's no way out. Rodriguez has already agreed to a double shift, but I need an experienced sergeant, just for today." Baker sighed and nodded. "Okay, give me 5 minutes to call home." The conversation with his wife was short and tense. He could hear the frustration in her voice as he explained the situation. Another missed family dinner, another broken promise. It was already 10 p.m. Baker was patrolling the dark highway paired with Rodriguez. The rain had begun to drizzle, turning the asphalt into a black mirror reflecting the headlights of the rare passing cars. "Hey, look, isn't that Summers' car?" Rodriguez asked suddenly, pointing to a patrol car on the side of the road. Baker tensed, peering through the raindrops on the windshield. "Looks like it. What's she doing in our sector?" They pulled up next to each other. Nicole was sitting behind the wheel, writing something. When she saw them, she rolled down her window. "Is everything all right?" Rodriguez asked. "Yeah, just finishing up my arrest report. You guys double shift here too?" "Jenkins came down with the flu," Rodriguez explained. "What are you doing here? Weren't you assigned to 93? "Martinez is in there with the new guy. Taylor transferred me here after you agreed to do the night shift." Baker sat silent, his face impenetrable. "All right, we'll be in touch," Rodriguez said, and they drove on. As they pulled away, Rodriguez glanced at his partner. "Something going on between you two? You tensed up when you saw her." "Don't bullshit me," Baker snapped back. "Hey, I'm just asking. There's all kinds of rumors." "What kind of rumors?" Baker asked sharply, not taking his eyes off the road. "Oh, come on. Everyone can see how you've been avoiding each other the last couple weeks. You used to be okay with each other, but now, I don't like the way she works," Baker said. "Too confident for a rookie." Rodriguez chuckled, but didn't pursue the subject further. Around midnight, the rain intensified to the point where visibility dropped to a minimum. Dispatch reported several sections of highway closed due to the threat of flooding. "All South Sector patrols," Taylor's voice came over the radio. "Due to weather conditions, we're reassessing areas of responsibility. Baker, Rodriguez, take the section from mile 86 to mile 92nd. Summers, 92nd to the county line. Keep in constant communication." "Copy that," Baker replied. Half an hour later, Rodriguez asked for a 15-minute break at a roadside cafe, the only working place for miles around. Baker reluctantly agreed. Inside, it was warm and dry. The few customers, mostly truckers, sipped coffee, waiting out the bad weather. Baker ordered a black coffee and sat at the far table, staring out the window at the rain-blurred lights of passing cars. His thoughts were darker than the night outside the window. About 10 minutes later, the door to the cafe opened and a drenched Nicole walked in. She didn't notice Baker right away, ordered a coffee, and only then, looking around, did she see him. After a second's hesitation, she made her way to his table. "May I?" she asked, pointing to an empty chair. "Free country," Baker shrugged. They sat in awkward silence while Rodriguez chatted with the bartender at the bar. "James, we need to talk," Nicole finally said quietly, leaning closer. "Not here," he answered just as quietly, casting a quick glance at Rodriguez. "Then where? You've been avoiding me for 2 weeks now." "Because it was a mistake, and you know it." There was a flicker of resentment in her eyes, quickly replaced by determination. "Look, She was interrupted by the radio. Dispatch was calling all available officers to mile 94, a serious accident with casualties. "I'll talk to you later," Baker said, rising from his desk. At 2 a.m, when they were done with processing the accident and sending the injured to the hospital, Taylor came on the line again. "Rodriguez, go back to the station. Martinez will replace you. He's on his way to see you now. Baker, Summers, you two check out the bypass through the hills. Locals say there might be a landslide." Baker and Nicole looked across the rain-soaked road. Their faces seemed like tense masks in the flashing lights. "We're taking the bypass," Baker confirmed into the radio. Rodriguez drove away, and Baker and Nicole were alone in the pouring rain, each at his own patrol car. "Should we take 1 or 2? Nicole asked. 2. That way we can cover more ground." "Okay, I'll go first. You follow." They pulled onto a narrow side road, winding between the hills. The road was deserted, lit only by the headlights of their cars and occasional flashes of lightning. After about 5 miles, the radio in Baker's car came to life. "Sarge, there's a fork in the road. I'll take the right road, check the other side of the hill. Copy that. Stay in touch." Baker took the left road. The rain continued to pound down, turning the country road into a muddy mess. 15 minutes later, he called Nicole. "Summers, give me a status report." Silence. "Officer Summers, come in." Silence again, only the hiss of static. Baker turned the car around and drove back to the fork, trying again and again to contact Nicole. His anxiety was growing by the minute. He told dispatch that he had lost contact with Officer Summers and was heading back to the last known point of her location. When he reached the fork, he turned onto the right-hand road and drove slowly, peering carefully into the darkness beyond the cone of headlights. The silence on the radio was growing more ominous by the minute. The precinct was starting to worry too. "Baker, did you find her?" Taylor's voice sounded tense. "Not yet. Still looking. Martinez and Jenkins are on their way to help you. Keep us posted." Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled. followed by a bright flash of lightning that illuminated the area for a few seconds. And in that flash, Baker saw something that made his heart skip a beat. Nicole's patrol car was parked on the side of the road a few hundred meters ahead with its parking lights on. "Found her car," he radioed, speeding up. As he got closer, he saw that the driver's door was open, but Nicole was nowhere to be seen. "Summers!" he shouted, jumping out into the pouring rain. "Nicole!" Only the sound of the rain answered him. The rain didn't stop, turning the ground around Nicole's car into a viscous mess. Baker activated a powerful flashlight and began to survey the perimeter, calling out the missing colleague's name over and over. The beam of light picked out wet bushes and rocks from the darkness, but there was no sign of Nicole. "Dispatch, Summers' car has been located on a side road about 2 miles from the fork. No officer on scene," he radioed. "Doors open, radios in place. Looks like she got out for some reason." "Roger that, Baker. Keep looking. Reinforcements are on their way." He walked around the car and noticed that the hood was warm. The engine had been shut down recently. Inside, everything seemed untouched. The clipboard on the passenger seat, the half-drunk coffee in the cup holder. Nicole's personal belongings, her purse and cell phone, were also in place. Baker stepped away from the car, aiming the flashlight beam farther into the shrubbery. About 30 meters from the road, the ground sloped sharply downward, forming a shallow ravine. Rainwater ran down there, making the slope a slippery slope. Something compelled him to direct the light there. And then he saw a hand protruding lifelessly from behind a large boulder at the bottom of the ravine. "No," Baker whispered, feeling the cold sweat mixing with the raindrops on his face. He cautiously climbed down, slipping on the wet ground. Stepping around the boulder, he saw what he feared most. Nicole Summers lay face down, her blonde hair soaked with a mixture of mud and blood. Her uniform jacket was soaked through, and her right arm was twisted at an unnatural angle. Baker knelt down beside the body and pressed his fingers to Nicole's neck, even though he already knew he wouldn't find a pulse. Slowly turning the body over, he saw a pale face with closed eyes and a dark wound on her temple. "Dispatch." His voice sounded hoarse. "Officer Summers has been located. No sign of life. Looks like a fall down a slope. We need medics and an investigation team, now." The precinct declared an emergency. All available patrols were dispatched to the scene. 15 minutes later, the bypass road was filled with police cars with flashing lights, illuminating the night landscape with blue and red flashes. Medics arrived, but only pronounced her dead. Lieutenant Taylor, one of the first to arrive, stood under an umbrella, looking at the body, which was now covered by a tarp. "What happened here, Baker?" she asked as the sergeant came up to her. "I don't know. We got separated at a fork in the road." When she stopped answering, I went looking. Found the car and then her body at the bottom of the ravine. "It's a dangerous area. She could have slipped in this weather," Taylor said thoughtfully. "Strange that she got out of the car at all, though." Baker was silent as he watched the forensics team in white coveralls stretch plastic sheeting around the scene. The rain finally began to subside, turning to a light drizzle. "Look, James." Taylor put her hand on his shoulder. "I know this is hard. You can go home now. Your shift is long over." "No, I'm staying. I want to know what happened." At that moment, an unremarkable black sedan pulled up to the scene. A tall man wearing a dark trench coat over his suit got out. He showed his ID to the officer guarding the perimeter and walked toward Taylor and Baker. "Detective Alex Morgan, homicide," he introduced himself. "I've been notified of the officer's death." "Lieutenant Veronica Taylor," she nodded. "This is Sergeant James Baker," he discovered the body. Morgan was about Baker's age, but he looked different, more refined, with attentive gray eyes that seemed to notice every detail. His dark hair was neatly slicked back with a gray streak. "Tell me what happened, Sergeant," Morgan asked, pulling out a small notebook. Baker repeated his story, careful not to leave out any details. Morgan listened without interrupting, making occasional notes. "When was the last time you had contact with Officer Summers?" "Around 3 a.m. She reported she was on her way to check out the right side of the road and I took the left." "Did you pair up regularly?" "No," Baker shook his head. "We usually have different shifts. Today was an emergency assignment because of weather conditions." "I see." Morgan shifted his gaze to where the forensics team was working. "Can I see the body?" Taylor led him toward the ravine. Baker followed them, feeling the fatigue and shock begin to take its toll. He wanted to just sit down and close his eyes, but he forced himself to move. At the bottom of the ravine, under an awning held by two officers, the medical examiner was examining Nicole's body. "Dr. Chen," Morgan nodded to the familiar examiner. "What can you tell me?" "Detective," he replied, looking up. "Preliminary, head trauma from hitting a rock. Death occurred about 2 or 3 hours ago, but there are nuances I don't like." "Like what?" Morgan frowned. "The nature of the wound on the temple. It's not exactly what we usually see in a fall, but I'll be able to tell you more after the autopsy." Baker felt his heart start to race. "You don't think it was an accident?" he asked in a hoarse voice. Dr. Chen looked at the sergeant carefully. "I'm just saying that there are some oddities. It's too early to draw conclusions." "I want to take a look at her car," Morgan said as he went upstairs. Nicole's patrol car was already taped off, and forensics was methodically processing it, collecting prints and other evidence. "What do we know about Officer Summers?" Morgan asked, looking at the car. "Nicole's been with us for 2 years," Taylor replied. "Transferred in from San Diego. Good officer, efficient, single as far as I know. She has a brother," Baker said suddenly. "Kevin. She mentioned he lives somewhere in Sacramento." Morgan made a note in his notebook. "We need to get in touch with him. Lieutenant, can you do that?" By 6 a.m., the scene was completely cordoned off. Nicole's body had been taken to the morgue, and her car was to be sent to the lab for a detailed examination. The sky was beginning to lighten, giving birth to a gray, bleak dawn. Detective Morgan gathered everyone involved in the case in the mobile command center, a van equipped with everything needed for a field investigation. "This is what we have so far," he said, pointing to a map of the area. "Officer Summers was found dead in a ravine about 30 meters from her vehicle. Preliminary cause of death is head trauma. Time of death was between 2 o'clock and 4 a.m. We're awaiting a detailed forensic report, but we're considering all possibilities. Accident, suicide, and murder." "Suicide?" Baker was indignant. "That's absurd. Nicole would never—" "Sergeant," Morgan interrupted him. "At this point, we have to consider all options. Personally, I'm leaning toward accident or murder, but we need facts." Baker clenched his jaw but remained silent. "I want statements from everyone who had contact with Officer Summers in the last 24 hours, Morgan continued. "Sergeant Baker, you were one of the last people to see her. We'll start with you." In the small section of the mobile center that served as a makeshift interview room, Morgan switched on the recorder. Detective Alex Morgan, interviewing Sergeant James Baker in the death of Officer Nicole Summers. "Sergeant, tell us about your relationship with the deceased." "We were co-workers. Professional relationship." "Nothing more?" Morgan stared at Baker. "What do you mean?" "Just a question. The station says there's been tension between you two lately." Baker straightened up. "Says who?" "That's not important. What matters is what you answer." Baker was silent for a moment, considering his answer. "We had a disagreement on the job. Nicole was a young officer with big ambitions. Sometimes her methods seemed to me risky. We argued a couple times. About what exactly?" "She wanted more involvement in drug investigations. She thought patrol officers should have more authority. I told her it wasn't our job." Morgan nodded, making notes. "Tell me exactly what happened tonight from the moment you split up at the fork." Baker repeated his story, careful not to leave out any details. "After we split up, I took the left road. Inspected the site. Everything was in order. 15 or 20 minutes later, I called her on the radio. She didn't answer. I tried a few more times, then decided to go back and check." "How much time elapsed between when you split up and when you located her car?" "About 40 minutes, maybe a little longer." "And before you found the body?" "Another 10 minutes." "I looked around the car first, then started looking around." Morgan tapped his pen thoughtfully on his notebook. "What do you think would make Officer Summers get out of the car in this weather?" "I don't know. Maybe she saw something? A strange sound or movement. But you didn't hear any radio calls? No reports that she was about to get out?" "No, nothing." Morgan paused, looking intently at Baker. "Sergeant, where were you between 3 and 3:30 at night?" Baker frowned. "I told you, patrolling the left-hand side of the road. Can anyone confirm that?" "No, I was alone. but my GPS tracker in the car should show the route. We'll check it out, Morgan nodded. One last question. Have you noticed anything unusual in Officer Summers' behavior in recent days? Was she anxious or scared about anything? Baker hesitated, but only for a second. No, nothing like that. After questioning Baker, Morgan interviewed several other patrol officers, including Officer Rodriguez, who had seen Nicole at the cafe. All of the statements agreed on one thing. There was nothing unusual about her behavior. By noon, Nicole's brother Kevin Summers arrived at the station. A tall man with the same blonde hair as his sister, he looked shaken, but held himself with a kind of fierce composure. "I want to know everything," he said to Morgan after a formal expression of condolence. "How did it happen? Who will be held responsible?" "Mr. Summers, the investigation has only just begun. We're still looking at an accident." "Accident?" Kevin grinned bitterly. "My sister wasn't the type to fall into a ravine by accident. She was too careful." "Have you been in contact with her lately? Did she say anything about problems at work or in her personal life?" Kevin thought for a moment. "We talked 2 weeks ago. She seemed, troubled. Said she was in a difficult situation but didn't want to go into details over the phone. Said she'd tell me when she saw me." "What kind of situation?" "She didn't specify. But I know her. If Nicole was worried, it must have been something serious." Morgan nodded, making notes. "Were you aware of any conflicts with coworkers? With Sergeant Baker, for example?" Kevin tensed. "Baker? She'd mentioned that name. I don't remember the context, but I don't think she thought highly of him." "Why not?" "Just a hunch. Something in the way she talked about him." Morgan nodded understandingly. "Mr. Summers, we're going to do everything we can to find out what happened to your sister. In the meantime, you need to identify the body and handle the funeral." "I want to see the place where she was found," Kevin said abruptly. "You don't have to. Believe me, it's an ordeal." "I have to," Kevin insisted. "I have to see it with my own eyes." Morgan hesitated, but finally agreed. They went to the side road where the forensics team was still working. The rain had finally stopped, but the sky was still gray and low. Kevin stood on the edge of the ravine for a long time, looking at the spot where his sister's body had been found. His face was pale but determined. "There's something wrong here," he finally said. Why had she gotten out of the car in the first place? What drew her to this place? "We're trying to find out," Morgan replied. "Who was with her that night? Who was patrolling the area?" "Sergeant Baker. He found her body." Kevin turned sharply to the detective. "And you believe him?" "I have no reason not to," Morgan answered cautiously. "But I'm checking all leads." "Check him more carefully." Kevin took one last look at the ravine. "My sister wasn't a frivolous person. If she got out of the car in this weather, there was a good reason." Back at the station, Morgan found that the first forensic results had come in. Dr. Chen was waiting for him at the makeshift investigation headquarters. "What do you got, Doctor?" Morgan asked. "I've finished my preliminary examination," Chen replied, laying out the photos and diagrams on the table. "And I can say with certainty, it was not an accident." "Murder?" "Yes. The wound on the temple is not consistent with a fall. The shape and depth of the injury indicate blunt force trauma. There are also signs of strangulation on the neck, partial hematomas that were almost invisible due to the dirt and poor lighting at the scene." Morgan scrutinized the photos. "Time of death?" "Between 2:30 and 3:30 at night. Can't be more precise because of the rain, which lowered the body temperature faster than usual." "Anything else?" "Yeah," Chen pointed to a photo of the victim's hands. "There are traces of skin and tissue under the fingernails." She fought back desperately. "DNA? Already sent it to the lab. We should have results in a day or two." Morgan thanked the expert and stared thoughtfully at the board of photographs and notes. The case was taking an unexpected turn. If Nicole Summers had been murdered, who had done it and why? He turned back to the notes on Baker's testimony. The sergeant claimed to have been patrolling the left side of the road at the time of Nicole's death. That could be verified from his car's GPS track. "Officer Jenkins," he turned to the deputy, "request the GPS tracker data from Sergeant Baker's patrol car from last night. I need to know the exact route from 2 to 4 o'clock." "Will do, sir." Morgan stepped outside. The daylight, though muted by clouds, seemed inappropriately bright after a night of rain and death. He lit a cigarette, moving farther away from the station entrance. Baker approached him, looking exhausted but determined. "Detective, I heard you declared it a homicide. Is that true?" Morgan looked at the sergeant carefully. "Where did that information come from?" "Rumors travel fast," Baker shrugged, "especially when it involves the death of a police officer." "Yes, that's the suspicion," Morgan finally answered. "But we haven't made an official statement yet. I'd like to help with the investigation." "I'm afraid that's not possible, Sergeant. You're too close to the case." "That's exactly why," Baker insisted. "I knew Nicole well. I can help you figure out who might have wanted to hurt her." "Do you have any ideas about that?" Baker hesitated. "Not specific names, but Nicole was principled. She could step on someone's toes." "Like what?" "A couple months ago, she pulled over a man for speeding who turned out to be Judge Rayner's nephew. The guy was drunk, but the judge pressured her to drop the case. Nicole was furious." Morgan made a mental note to verify that information. "What else?" "She'd been working on something on her own lately. She wouldn't share details, but she hinted she was onto something big." "And you didn't ask what it was about?" "I did. She was evasive, said she wanted to gather more evidence first." Morgan looked at Baker appraisingly. Something about the sergeant's demeanor seemed, insincere. Too much enthusiasm for a man who had previously admitted to a strained relationship with the deceased. "Sergeant, I appreciate your willingness to help, but right now, the best help is to let me do my job. If I have any questions, I'll come to you." Baker was clearly unhappy, but he didn't argue. As he left, Morgan noticed Nicole's brother watching their conversation from the doorway of the station. The look on Kevin's face was grim and suspicious. Later, while reviewing the CCTV footage from the cafe where Baker and Nicole had talked shortly before her death, Morgan noticed something odd. The quality of the footage wasn't great, but it was clear that their conversation was tense. Nicole was leaning toward Baker, saying something that was clearly making him nervous. This contradicted the version of a purely professional relationship that the sergeant was presenting. The investigation was just beginning, but Morgan already sensed that there was a lot more mystery to the case than first appeared. On the third day of the investigation, Alex Morgan sat in his temporary office at the station, surrounded by files of documents, photographs, and notes. The wall opposite had been turned into a schematic of the investigation. In the center, a photo of Nicole Summers around, the timeline of events, names of witnesses, evidence. From fatigue, the detective's eyes turned red, but he was not going to give up. Officer Jenkins knocked on the open door. "Detective, here's the GPS tracker data from Sergeant Baker's car that you requested." Morgan took the folder and began scrutinizing the printed maps with the patrol car's waypoints marked. "That's odd," he muttered. "What is it, sir?" According to this data, Baker was indeed patrolling the left side of the road at the time of the alleged murder. His car didn't go anywhere near where Nicole was found. So he was telling the truth? Maybe, Morgan replied thoughtfully. Or maybe... He didn't finish his thought, but an alternate version of events was already forming in his mind. "Jenkins, get me all the information you can on Sergeant Baker's personal life, family, children, finances, anything you can find." "Yes, sir." Left alone, Morgan went back to watching the videotapes. For the third time, he scrolled through the snippet from the cafe where Nicole and Baker had talked shortly before her death. Their bodies, the tilt of their heads, the gestures, everything spoke of more than just a working relationship. There was another knock on the door. Kevin Summers stood on the threshold. "Mr. Summers," Morgan stepped forward. "What can I do for you?" "I just came from my sister's apartment," Kevin said. "I was looking for papers for the funeral arrangements, and I found something. I thought you might want to see it." He handed Morgan an envelope. "What is it?" "I don't know." It was hidden in her personal journal, sealed but signed, to be opened in the event of my death. I didn't open it. Morgan took the envelope carefully. The inscription was indeed written in a woman's neat handwriting. "Thank you for bringing this," he said. "It may be important." "I want to be present at the autopsy," Kevin said. It's about my sister. Morgan hesitated. The rules were that he wasn't supposed to allow outsiders into potential evidence. But something in Kevin's eyes, a mixture of pain and determination, made him agree. All right, but I'll read it first. He carefully opened the envelope. Inside were 2 pieces of paper. The first was a handwritten note, the second a printout of an email correspondence. Morgan began to read the note. If you're reading this, it means something has happened to me. Over the past few months, I've been gathering information about possible corruption in our department. Several officers, including Sergeant Baker, may have been involved in withholding evidence and taking bribes from drug dealers operating in our territory. Enclosed is a printout of the correspondence I was able to recover from the informant's cell phone. Be careful. Nicole Summers. Morgan shifted his gaze to the second page. It was a printout of text messages between 2 callers identified only as DB and NS. DB, tonight, same precinct, 20 minutes. NS, I can't, I'm on shift. DB, switch with someone, it's important. NS, one last time. After that, we have to stop everything. DB, you say that every time. NS, I'm serious now, it's too risky. DB, we'll talk about it tonight. Kevin, who was reading over the detective's shoulder, whined quietly. DB, James Baker? Maybe, Morgan replied, rereading the messages. But NS is probably Nicole Summers. Had they met? Kevin sounded incredulous. Looks like it, and something went wrong. She mentions corruption. Maybe she found out about his dirty deeds and threatened to expose them. That's a motive, Morgan nodded. But we need proof. He called Jenkins in and instructed him to find all communications between Baker and Nicole and to check their bank accounts for unusual transactions. An hour later, the detective was standing in front of Lieutenant Taylor, displaying the evidence he'd found. You're accusing one of my top officers of murder based on a few text messages? She asked, skeptically. Not just that, Morgan replied. The medical examiner confirmed that Nicole was murdered. DNA was found under her fingernails, which is being tested now. Her note mentions corruption in the department. And look at these bank statements. He showed the documents he got from Jenkins. In the last 6 months, several large sums of cash have been deposited into Baker's account, the origin of which he can't explain. And most interestingly, there are similar amounts in the account of Officer Martinez, who often works in tandem with Baker. James couldn't have done it. Taylor shook her head. I've known him for 15 years. People aren't always what they seem, Lieutenant. What's next? I want to question Baker formally, with a lawyer and a tape. Taylor reluctantly agreed. Baker was called to the station where Morgan and Homeland Security were waiting. Sergeant Baker, Morgan began when the formalities had been completed. Tell us about your relationship with Officer Summers. Baker, remaining calm, looked at his attorney, then answered, I've already told you. We were co-workers. Nothing more than that? Morgan placed a printout of the messages on the table. Explain this correspondence. Baker turned pale but quickly pulled himself together. It's personal. Yes, we had a relationship, but it had nothing to do with her death. When did the relationship begin? About 6 months ago, after a tour of duty together. You're married, Sergeant. You have 2 children. I know. Baker lowered his eyes. It was a mistake. Nicole thought so too. We were going to end it. But she wanted to end it and you didn't? Morgan asked, pointing to the messages. Yeah, I didn't want to, but I would never hurt her. How about this one? Morgan placed Nicole's note on the table. She suspected you of corruption. She was gathering evidence. Baker's face changed. Fear flashed in his eyes. It's a lie. She didn't realize anything. Explain the deposits into your account. Large sums of cash. It's an investment. I was investing in my brother's business. What kind of business? A car repair shop. Morgan made a note in his notebook. Sarge, where were you between 2:30 and 3:30 the night Nicole died? I told you I was patrolling the left side of the road. Your GPS tracker confirms it. But here's the interesting thing. At certain points, the signal was lost for a few minutes. How do you explain that? Baker frowned. It's common in that area. Hills, bad reception. Or someone was intentionally turning off the tracker, Morgan suggested. For example, to leave the car and leave no trace. That's absurd! The interrogation continued for another hour. Baker denied all the accusations, but his version of events contained more and more contradictions. When the detective asked about the bloodstains found on the lining of his jacket, Baker could not give a coherent explanation. After the interview, Morgan met with Kevin Summers, who was waiting in the hallway. "What did he say?" Kevin asked. "Denies involvement in the murder, but admits to a relationship with your sister." "Do you believe him?" Morgan thought for a moment. "No. There are too many inconsistencies, but we need stronger evidence to make an arrest. Is there anything I can do?" "Not yet, but stay in touch." That same evening, Morgan got a call from the lab. The DNA under Nicole's fingernails matched Baker's. That was enough for an arrest warrant. Baker was taken into custody at his home in front of his wife and kids. He did not resist but continued to maintain his innocence. At the station, after the arraignment, Morgan decided to give Baker one last chance. "James," he said when he was alone with the arrestee, "I know what happened. You had a relationship with Nicole. She found out about your illicit affairs and decided to report it. You couldn't let that happen." Baker was silent for a long time, then said quietly, "You don't understand. It wasn't like that. Tell me what it was." "I loved her," Baker said at last. "I really did. I wanted to leave my wife, start a new life. But Nicole didn't want to be the cause of the divorce. She decided to end it." "So you killed her?" Morgan looked him right in the eye. "No, I didn't mean to. It was an accident." "Accidental?" There was doubt in the detective's voice. "We agreed to meet that night. To talk. I left my car and walked to her place so I wouldn't leave a trail. She said it was over, that she knew about the money I'd taken, threatened to tell me everything." He fell silent, gathering his thoughts. "I tried to talk her out of it. We argued. She got out of the car, turned to leave. I grabbed her arm. She resisted, and we began to struggle. The rain, the slippery ground. She fell and hit her head on a rock. And instead of calling for help, you decided to fake an accident?" I panicked. Baker's voice was shaking. "She wasn't breathing anymore. If this got out, my career, my family, everything would be ruined." "So you moved the body into the ravine and then found it when you came back with the patrol?" "Yes," Baker answered quietly. "God, what have I done?" Morgan shook his head. "And the money? Did you really take bribes?" "Martinez got me into it. Said it was easy money. All I had to do was warn certain people about raids, sometimes overlook certain cars. I knew it was wrong, but my daughters were going to college. My wife lost her job." "And Nicole found out about this?" "Yeah. She noticed our meetings with the dealers, started asking questions. I couldn't lie to her, and she couldn't deal with it." Morgan closed the notebook. The confession was recorded, the case was solved, but the gravity of the situation wasn't diminished. A good cop, an experienced sergeant, and such a tragic career ending. The trial took place 3 months later. James Baker was found guilty of manslaughter and corruption. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Officer Martinez and 3 other police officers also received terms for their involvement in the corruption scheme. Nicole Summers' funeral was attended by the entire precinct. Lieutenant Taylor gave a speech about honesty and loyalty to duty. Kevin stood silent, dry-eyed, looking at a framed picture of his sister. After the ceremony, he approached Morgan. "Thank you, Detective, for not giving up." "I was just doing my job," Morgan replied. "I wish Nicole had come to us sooner. She was always trying to solve problems on her own." Kevin grinned bitterly. "She'd been like that since she was a kid. Stubborn. Brave," Morgan corrected. "But sometimes bravery has to be coupled with caution." They were silent for a moment, staring at the fresh grave. "What will you do next?" Morgan asked. "I'm going to set up a fund in her name to help policewomen who face discrimination or harassment in the workplace, so they won't be afraid to speak up. It's a worthy cause." A year later, Alex Morgan stood at the podium next to Kevin Summers at the opening of the first Nicole Summers Support Center. Dozens of police officers, men and women in uniform, were in the audience, coming to support the initiative. A photo of Nicole in her dress uniform with a serious and determined look stared back at them from the wall. The story of her life and death had become a symbol of the struggle for honesty and justice within the police force. "Sometimes the truth lies on the surface," Morgan said in his speech, "but we don't see it because we're not ready for it." Nicole was ready to see the truth, no matter how bitter it was, and for that she paid the ultimate price. It is our duty to make sure her sacrifice was not in vain. In state prison, James Baker kept a diary. Every day he wrote letters he never sent, to his daughters, to his ex-wife, who filed for divorce after his arrest, and to Nicole, especially a lot to Nicole. He asked for her forgiveness in every letter, knowing he would never get it. Nicole Summers' service ID photo, smiling and full of life, stood on his nightstand, the only thing he was allowed to keep of his personal belongings. Sometimes, looking at it, he thought about how one decision, one moment of weakness could change a whole life, and not just his, but the lives of so many others. The truth always comes to the surface, sooner or later.